September 18th, 1918, a British general stood watching Australian soldiers prepare for battle and said something he would regret for the rest of his life. These men do not look like Australians. They look like something that should be driven from the battlefield at bayonet point. He was staring at the filthiest, most undisciplined-looking soldiers he had ever seen in 4 years of war. Their uniforms were caked in mud. They sprawled in shell craters instead of standing at attention. Some were barefoot. They looked like bandits, not soldiers. What this general did not know was that in exactly 73 hours, these same dirty soldiers would accomplish what the entire British Empire had failed to do for 4 years. They would break the Hindenburg Line, the most fortified defensive position ever built in human history, and they would do it so efficiently that German commanders would spend decades trying to figure out what went wrong. But here is what makes this story truly shocking. The reason these soldiers looked so terrible was precisely the reason they would succeed where everyone else had failed, and I am going to show you exactly how a group of men who disgusted their own allies became the most effective fighting force on the Western Front. First, let me tell you who was watching them. British General Henry Rawlinson commanded the Fourth Army. He had led men through the Somme, through Passchendaele, through 3 years of industrial slaughter. He knew warfare, he knew discipline, he knew what professional soldiers should look like, and what he was looking at near the village of Bellicourt in northern France did not look professional at all. The soldiers assembling for the attack were from the Australian 3rd and 5th Divisions. Rawlinson turned to his aide and delivered his brutal assessment. The aide, a captain named Edmund Herring who had worked with Australians for 18 months, said nothing. He knew something the general did not. Now here is where it gets interesting, because everything Rawlinson saw as failure was actually tactical genius, and I am going to explain exactly why. Those filthy uniforms? Not neglect. Camouflage. Australian soldiers had discovered something British doctrine never considered. Freshly cleaned khaki uniforms reflected sunlight. German snipers could spot clean uniforms from 400 meters away. Dirty uniforms blended into the cratered mud of the Western Front. The equation was simple. Men in clean uniforms died. Men in filthy uniforms survived. The apparent lack of discipline? That was tactical flexibility. British doctrine required rigid formations, stand here, move there, wait for orders. Australian doctrine was completely different. If a corporal saw a better route forward, he took it without asking permission. If a private spotted an opportunity, he could act on it immediately. This looked like chaos to British observers watching from headquarters, but on the battlefield, it meant Australian soldiers could adapt faster than any enemy could react. The men sprawling in shell craters were not resting. They were studying terrain, every fold in the ground, every drainage pattern, every sight line. Australian soldiers learned to read landscape the way you read a book. When the attack came, they would move through that ground like they had lived there for years, and those barefoot soldiers, they were preparing for close combat. Boots filled with mud weighed several kilograms. Bare feet gave better grip on wet duckboards and allowed completely silent movement through enemy trenches. It looked primitive. It was ruthlessly practical. But I need to tell you about the man leading these soldiers, because his story explains everything about why they were so different. Lieutenant General John Monash was everything the British military establishment distrusted. He was Jewish in an army that remained casually anti-Semitic. He was a civil engineer, not a professional soldier who went to the right schools. He had earned his rank through colonial militia service, not through family connections. He spoke with an Australian accent that British officers found grating, and worst of all, he questioned established doctrine instead of following it blindly. British general staff officers had lobbied against his promotion. They said he lacked proper background. They implied his engineering mind was unsuited for command. They suggested his religion was problematic, but the British Empire was running out of options, and the target Monash was about to attack was the reason why. The Hindenburg Line was not just a trench. It was 200 kilometers of fortifications that represented Germany's last hope. German military engineers had spent 2 years building what they considered an impregnable position. Multiple trench lines separated by hundreds of meters, deep concrete bunkers immune to artillery, machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire covering every approach, barbed wire barriers up to 30 meters deep, And at its heart, near Bellicourt, was the Saint-Quentin Canal, an 18-metre wide canal, 10 metres deep, fortified on both banks with concrete pillboxes and machine gun nests. Elite Prussian Guard divisions defended this sector. German commanders called it unbreakable. They had good reason for confidence. In April 1917, the French lost over 100,000 men trying to breach the Hindenburg Line, and failed completely. British attacks in late 1917 gained nothing despite massive artillery bombardment. The Germans believed any attacking force would bleed to death on the wire before reaching the first trench. Now, here is what makes Monash's plan so radical. He looked at every previous failure and did the exact opposite. British doctrine called for days of artillery bombardment before infantry attacked. The idea was to destroy enemy positions before soldiers advanced. Monash said no. Prolonged bombardment destroyed surprise, turned the ground into impassable mud, and rarely eliminated well-built defences. Instead, he planned a brief, violent bombardment timed to coincide exactly with infantry advance. British doctrine used tanks as independent breakthrough weapons. Monash said integrate them directly with infantry, moving at walking pace, providing mobile cover and destroying machine guns as they appeared. British doctrine demanded massive formations that could overwhelm strong points through sheer numbers. Monash said use small groups moving quickly through gaps in the defence, using terrain for cover. British doctrine concentrated all authority at headquarters. Junior officers waited for orders before acting. Monash gave company commanders unprecedented authority to adapt as battlefield conditions changed. British staff officers reviewed his plan and predicted catastrophic failure. The artillery was insufficient. The formations were too dispersed. The command structure was too flexible. Monash ignored them. He had been ignoring British orthodoxy since Gallipoli. His soldiers were still alive because of it. On September 18th, while General Rawlinson was expressing disgust at Australian appearance, Monash was conducting final briefings. And here is something that will shock you. He explained the entire plan to his soldiers, not just their specific tasks, but the overall strategy, the why behind every order. British doctrine forbade this. The assumption was that enlisted men and junior officers only needed to know their specific jobs. Monash treated his soldiers like intelligent adults who would fight better if they understood the complete picture. The Australian soldiers knew exactly what they were attempting. They knew about the Saint-Quentin Canal. They knew about the concrete bunkers and the machine guns and the Prussian guards waiting for them. They knew British forces had failed at this for 3 years. They knew their plan was different. What they did not know was that their own general considered them unfit for service. September 29th, 1918. 5:50 a.m. The morning was cold and foggy, visibility barely 50 meters. German sentries on the Hindenburg Line saw nothing concerning. No prolonged artillery bombardment, no obvious attack preparations, just another quiet morning. Then at 5:50 a.m. precisely, 1,600 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. But this was not the days-long bombardment Germans expected. It was a concentrated 12-minute storm targeting specific positions identified through weeks of intelligence gathering. At 6:02 a.m., the artillery shifted forward 200 meters. At that exact moment, Australian infantry emerged from their trenches and began advancing. Now watch what happened next, because this is where everything Rawlinson thought was wrong proved to be absolutely right. The fog that seemed like a disadvantage became devastating advantage. German machine gunners could not see targets until Australian soldiers were already within 30 meters. By then, supporting tanks were destroying gun positions with direct fire. Australian soldiers moved through fog in small groups, exactly as practiced. When they hit strong points, they did not attempt frontal assault. They moved around flanks. They used grenades and rifles. They closed with bayonets when necessary. German defenders found themselves fighting enemies who appeared from unexpected directions, who moved faster than seemed possible, who displayed tactical flexibility German doctrine could not counter. The Saint-Quentin Canal, the impregnable heart of the defensive system, was breached in 4 hours. Let me repeat that. 4 hours. British forces had tried for years. Australian engineers brought collapsible bridges and scaling ladders. While diversionary attacks fixed German attention on obvious crossing points, Assault groups crossed at unexpected locations using fog for concealment. By 10 a.m., they held both banks. German counterattacks failed repeatedly. Prussian Guard divisions, the finest soldiers in the German army, could not dislodge the Australians. Every counterattack met coordinated defense combining machine guns, rifles, and artillery, directed by forward observers communicating with unprecedented speed and accuracy. By nightfall, the Australian 3rd and 5th Divisions had advanced over 5 kilometres. They captured over 4,000 German prisoners. They seized 76 artillery pieces. They broke the Hindenburg Line across an 8-kilometre front. Their casualties? Approximately 1,260 killed and wounded. This was impossible. British forces had sustained 60,000 casualties at the Somme without breaking German lines. French forces lost 100,000 men in the Nivelle offensive without achieving breakthrough. The Hindenburg Line was supposed to be stronger than any position previously encountered. Australian forces broke it in one day with minimal casualties. General Rawlinson arrived at Monash's headquarters on September 30th to confirm the reports. What he saw stunned him into silence. Australian soldiers were consolidating positions 6 kilometres beyond the Hindenburg Line. German prisoners were being processed in overwhelming numbers. Captured artillery was being turned around to fire on retreating German forces. Rawlinson offered formal apology to Monash. He acknowledged that he had misjudged both the soldiers and their commander. He recommended Monash for immediate knighthood. But here is what you need to understand about why this matters beyond just one battle. The breakthrough at Bellicourt started the 100 Days offensive that ended the war. Over the following 6 weeks, Australian forces spearheaded the advance that drove German armies back across France. They captured Péronne, Montbretagne, dozens of fortified villages. They maintained offensive momentum British forces had been unable to sustain since 1914. The statistics are staggering. From August to November 1918, Australian forces made up roughly 10% of Allied strength on the Western Front, but they captured 29,000 German prisoners, 23% of total prisoners taken. They captured 338 artillery pieces, 21% of total German guns lost. They advanced faster, suffered fewer casualties, achieved more decisive results than any comparable Allied formation. This was not superior courage. British, French, Canadian, American soldiers were equally brave. This was superior tactics, superior leadership, superior organizational culture. And here is the lesson that military historians would study for the next century. The dirty soldiers who disgusted General Rawlinson possessed something more valuable than clean uniforms and rigid discipline. They possessed initiative. They possessed flexibility. They possessed practical intelligence. And they had leadership that trusted them to think, not just obey. German General Erich Ludendorff wrote after the war that the September 29th breakthrough convinced him Germany had lost. The Hindenburg Line was supposed to hold through 1919. Its collapse in one day destroyed that strategy. Ludendorff specifically noted Australian tactical methods, the speed of advance, the flexibility of execution. The Hindenburg Line fell not because Australian soldiers looked like professionals, but because they fought like professionals. They understood that war is not parade ground drill. War is mud and blood and improvisation under fire. War is making decisions when communications fail. War is adapting when plans collapse. The dirty diggers who broke the Hindenburg Line understood this. General Rawlinson learned it the hard way. Sometimes the dirtiest soldiers are the most effective soldiers. Sometimes the men who break every rule win the war. And sometimes appearance is the least important thing on any battlefield.